Hello, everyone. It is Glenn with the Northeast Georgia History Center. I am very excited to be bringing you this special presentation about military history in Georgia before the American Revolution. Some of you who have been watching know that I do love military history, and it's very interesting because the state of Georgia, or should I say the colony of Georgia, really began as a military colony. Now, we've gone through before how the colony worked as, is it a place where debtors can come and have a second chance? And is it Oglethorpe and the trustees' ideological dream to have this wonderful utopian place? Well, yes. But there were other things that played into Georgia. Oglethorpe was no slacker in terms of strategic thinking, and Parliament knew this as well. And so when Parliament agreed to the trustees being able to build this colony, this supposed utopian dream, they also had some strategic thoughts in mind because they had already two very important, very profitable colonies in the southern part of North America, North Carolina and South Carolina. And those two colonies were right up against what was a still strong Spanish Empire looking to assert its rights and its territorial schemes in North America. And so the idea is that yes, Georgia could be this utopian place where people could all be equal and there would be no slavery and no alcohol and things like that. But you know what else it could be? It could be a military buffer colony. If we could find the right type of colonists, if we could find the right type of people and supply them and equip them, they would be able to serve as something that could protect those two monetarily and economically valuable colonies, the Carolinas, as well as begin to grow into something economically profitable for itself. Remember, that's one of the real reasons that colonies were there is, well, not just to gain wealth, but to create smaller Englands away from England. And what better way to do that than to establish something that was going to be able to stand on its own, defend itself from the Spanish Empire, because Spain and England, of course, had been having fights for a long time, going well beyond Elizabeth and the Armada and things like that. But I'm going too far back. I digress. So this map that we've been looking at really sort of shows this region of Georgia, the eastern coast of North America, and sort of the southeast here. But let me go to this next map and give you a little bit more detail as to exactly what we're talking about and why what became Georgia is known as the disputed lands. Now, you have to remember that in these terms, Spain is the main enemy. And we tend to think, we English speakers and descendants of English colonies tend to think of Georgia as being founded in 1733, which it was. But we also have to remember that the Spanish had been in this part of the world for almost 200 years before the colony of Georgia was founded out of supposed nothing. And so Spain had heavily invested in terms of manpower, in terms of missions, and had created a very prosperous and powerful town a little bit south of Savannah called St. Augustine. And in St. Augustine, in what is today Florida, was sort of the powerhouse of Spanish holds. And the Spanish considered their territory, their territorial claims, pretty much all the way up into what is today North Carolina, well beyond the Savannah River, and perhaps even including Charleston. The English, of course, had different views on this. They saw English territory as coming down closer to Florida and probably pushing that at least the Altamaha River and maybe a little bit south of that. So hence the disputed lands, the disputed territory. And while Spain and England had much larger things that they had been arguing about and would come to conflict with, the colonies and the territorial gains in the New World were a big part of that. So you see with this map, you can sort of see where the real troubles lie and why Georgia became such an important part of England's strategy for holding on to its colonies in North America. Savannah was, of course, the main city in the colony of Georgia and was the main economic center, the main government center. And we're not going to get into Savannah right now. We've talked about that in other broadcasts. But the main military part of the colony of Georgia was Fort Frederica, which is right there on the coast. And this is an artist's representation of what Fort Frederica probably looked like at its peak in the early 1740s. And you can see this is a not insignificant town with classic European walls and fortifications going all the way around it, roads coming into it. It's right there on the coast along the river. And this is where many of the soldiers that were established by Oglethorpe in the colony of Georgia, we'll get to those in a second. But Fort Frederica, as I say, is really the military stronghold. This is where the soldiers are going to be based out of. This is going to be the main sort of staging point for water vehicles, for these patrol boats, of course, man-powered or sail-powered, that go up and down the Savannah River, that go up and down the Georgia coast, or the Florida coast, or the Carolina coast. We're still figuring that out right here in the 1730s. And so Fort Frederica is really a great example of how you get this military aspect to the colony very, very quickly. And you can see, again, this is not insubstantial, but I wanted to go to this next slide just to sort of give you a sort of a historical view. You can still visit Fort Frederica today, but there's not much left. Fort Frederica was built for war, was built for military conflict. And by the time you get to, say, 1750, the end of the trustee period, there is no military conflict in the colony of Georgia. There is no military threat, and the things that are based on the military tend to start to fizzle out and fade away. With the soldiers leaving, with no need for fortifications, no need to spend money on maintaining those fortifications and those support systems for the soldiers, Fort Frederica becomes not much more than a small village. And it's a really great example of how something very substantial in the past can dissolve into almost nothing. Fortunately, it's a great state site. You can go visit it now. I strongly recommend you do so. But the only structure left from this massive town, from this massive military base, is the powder magazine. You can see in the next slide, you can see these great stonework, sort of a building with crenellations on the top. That's all that's left of Fort Frederica that you can see above the ground. There's lots of archaeological work that's going on, but it's something that reminds us that military aspects of the colony tended to go away if that's all that there was to do with a particular aspect, like even a town. Of course, Savannah did eventually have walls put up around it to defend it. We've got Fort Frederica, and there are other fortified areas in the colony of Georgia. There's Fort St. Simon's down at the very southern tip of St. Simon's Island, where the Tybee Lighthouse where the Tybee Lighthouse is. There was also a small fort there that we have an illustration of, but this picture here is an artist rendering of Augusta, of the town of Augusta. Again, just to give you an idea, Augusta is a pretty major town, major city in Georgia now, but it began just as the fall line along the Savannah River, and it wasn't very big, but it still had to be fortified, not just against the Spanish, but against some of the Native American warriors too. You have to remember that even though Oglethorpe considered the Indians friends as often as he could, they still had to be ready for any conflicts that might arise between English settlers and the English colony of Georgia and the Native Americans that lived in this area. Now, so we have sort of a state-sponsored fort town. We have a town that happens to have fortifications around it. And in this next slide, talk about another thing just to show you how militarized Georgia was in its early years. Some of you may have been to Wormslow Plantation, which is another great state historic site. You can go there. And one of the interesting things that you will see at Wormslow is the remnants of a fortified home. So people were even having to make their homes have walls around them to protect themselves from who knows what, right? This is the frontier. This is when people are going to be defending themselves against a possible Spanish incursion, against a Native American uprising, or even against pirates. There were, I hate to go into pirates. We'll talk about that in a future broadcast. But there were pirates and raids that happened up and down the Georgia coast. And if you wanted to defend your goods, if you wanted to defend your family, you might have to have a good fortified position. So you can see here an artist rendering of what the Wormslow fortification, the home, looked like at one time. And when you go there today, you can still see some remnants of the walls that were put up as a defensive mechanism for a private home. So you have state-sponsored big towns, you have towns with walls, and you have private homes that are also going to be in effect, militarized to protect themselves from any violent incursion that may occur. So we've talked about a little bit about the places. Let's talk about the people. And of course, the first people who lived here before the English or even the Spanish got here were the Native Americans. And Native Americans had been warring with each other for quite some time. Tomochichi and the Yamacraw, who Oglethorpe first met when he came to Georgia, we think they might have been sort of outcast of the Creek or Muskogee people from further on inland in Georgia. And so making those good relations with Native Americans was something that was incredibly important to the trustees and especially to Oglethorpe, the man on the scene, because they could be one of two things. They could pose a very significant military threat to any colonists that came. The colonists are unestablished. They don't have a lot of weapons. They don't have a lot of people at first. And making friends with someone who could crush you and push you back into the sea is very important. There are also economic aspects, and there are just personal and moral aspects. Oglethorpe wanted everyone. Remember, Georgia is supposed to be this utopia where everyone gets along. So those relationships with the Native Americans were important on a variety of different levels. But one of those levels was a military level. He knew that they knew the land, they knew the territory, they knew how to fight in this particular kind of geography and topography. And so making friends with the Indians, with a native population, was going to be very important to Oglethorpe, and in some of the campaigns we're going to talk about later, you'll see how important they become and the roles that they could play in the defense of the colony or attacking Spanish colonies. Of course, in this next slide, this is obviously not the original drawing like I showed last time, but these are reenactors just to sort of give you an idea of the type of Native Americans that would be operating in Georgia and on behalf of Oglethorpe and with the colonists of Georgia. Moving forward, they're very lightly armed. They're not going to be the kind of fighters that stand in lines like we think of and have those classic linear formations and shoulder to shoulder firing their muskets. That's not how Native Americans operated. They're going to be great scouts. They're going to be great at ambush. They're going to be great at moving through the territory very easily with light supplies, moving very quickly. And they could therefore serve as scouts and they could serve as auxiliaries. Oglethorpe was not going to depend upon Native American contingents for the main body of his force. Instead, what he would do is he was going to recruit from two different areas, which we'll come to in just a moment. In this next slide, I want to talk about the main adversaries that he's going to be facing. There are the French, of course, and the French are not necessarily around St. Augustine. They're a little more to the west and to the south. The closer you get to the Gulf Coast and New Orleans, you're going to see more French soldiers and French fighters. But really, the Spanish soldiers that they bring in are going to be classic European drilled and equipped soldiers. They're going to have cocked hats, they're going to have coats, they're going to have flintlock muskets, and they're going to be trained to use that linear warfare, but depending upon how long they've been in the New World, whether that's in the colony of Florida, whether that's in Cuba or any of the other possessions of the Spanish crown, they are going to have some training on how the fighting would be done and how to use the terrain and things like that. But that's not to say that they're necessarily going to always fight that way. And this is something that Oglethorpe realizes with his own forces becomes a very, very important part of how he's going to move forward and establish the military body of men, the army, if you will, of Georgia. In this next slide, I've got an artist rendering of something that was the soldier that Oglethorpe wanted for Georgia. Oglethorpe, this is going to sound weird, one of his own school buddies was the King of England, and so he was able to go to the king and chat him up. And in using his connections at court, Oglethorpe was able to get the permission to raise an entire regiment of English soldiers to take them over specifically to be stationed in the colony of Georgia. Not only that, but he was able to use his influence to get them equipped with some of the most latest and up-to-date weapons and muskets of the time, including the Brown Bess musket. We've all talked about the Brown Bess. You've probably heard the name, but this is the first time period. It didn't come out until like the 1730s, the early 1730s. And Oglethorpe is able to equip his regiment entirely with the latest and state-of-the-art weapons. And they're going to be dressed as professional European soldiers. You can see here they have on the classic red coat already. They're faced in green with green cuffs and green facings there on the front. They're going to be trousered. They're not going to, be dressed as Native Americans. They're going to have on European clothing. They're all going to be uniformly equipped and uniformly dressed. And Oglethorpe's regiment, the 42nd, ends up having, we're not sure, it depends upon the time and the place, anywhere from 600 to 800 men that all go to the colony of Georgia. They're divided into detachments, usually company-sized, and they're placed at different strategic points around the colony. Of course, a couple of those companies would probably be at Fort Frederica at any one time, one in Savannah, parts in Augusta, thereabouts. It was very rare for Oglethorpe to bring the entire regiment together all at once, although that does happen, and we'll come to that in a second. But this becomes the most important military tool that Oglethorpe has at his disposal. And being regulars means they've enlisted for a certain amount of time. There's nowhere they can go. They're sort of trapped in the military, and so they are subject to military discipline. They're going to get proper training. They're going to be there for the long haul. That makes them incredibly reliable, loyal, and efficient soldiers. And so this 42nd Regiment that Oglethorpe has, who he is the colonel of, means that it is going to be the most interesting and most long-term tool he has to fight the Spanish. Now, as I said, the weapons that all these folks are going to be using are flintlock muskets. We have here an image of the classic Brown Bess musket. It is a 75 caliber musket with 46-inch barrel. The ignition system is flint and steel, right? A flintlock weapon with a bayonet. Now, again, the one that we have here is state-of-the-art. Not everyone in Georgia is going to have something that's a state-of-the-art military weapon. They're not all going to be able to have a bayonet. You're going to get a lot of trade guns. You're going to get a lot of older English military muskets and things like that. But the 42nd is going to have these Besses. And it's interesting because one of the things that every male colonist who came to Georgia was given is he was given a musket and given a certain amount of powder and ammunition, not just for hunting and self-defense, but again, Oglethorpe and the Georgia trustees knew that the men of Georgia were going to have to form a militia if you're going to be a military buffer for those Carolina colonies. They're going to need to have the wherewithal to fight, and they're going to have to be somewhat trained to do that. So the trustees actually issue every adult male a musket. This is not an inexpensive undertaking, and they have to make sure that these men are going to know how to use them. Well, what kind of non-regular military men did the colony of Georgia use? Well, this is a great drawing that we have here. It shows a wide variety. You can see there in front, you can see a member of Oglethorpe's 42nd. But we've also, there in the foreground, got what's called a ranger. Now, today we think of rangers as totally elite soldiers in the U.S. military, some of the best. They go through a lot of training. They're very, very good at what they do. But a ranger in this time period literally meant that they ranged around. They were usually a mounted unit. And these mounted units could number anywhere from 15 to 50. And there were different rangers. This guy in the front is from McKay's Rangers. And McKay, of course, was the captain. And their job, they would actually be paid. They had to provide all of their own equipment, all of their own clothing, all of their own weapons, which means they were not uniform by any stretch of the imagination, but they were paid for their service, and their job was basically literally to range. They would patrol all through the colony of Georgia. They would go all the way down to the south part and then up the coast and look at the roads and go up to Fort Frederica, check in there for a few days, get some more supplies, go up to Savannah, go into the back country, go to Ebenezer, maybe go to Augusta every once in a while, just to patrol the area to make sure that nothing was amiss. Not only are they looking for something that's amiss, but just the presence of them is going to keep order in the colony. And there in the background, there was another unit raised of Highland men. This is something I want to get to now to make a big deal of because it is important. When they are bringing people together to take part in the colony of Georgia, one of the first places they go recruit is in Scotland because they know these Scottish people can be very hard workers, but they also know if they're selective in recruiting that they are very, very tough fighters. And so if they can get enough Scottish folks down into Georgia and get them together as military units, they're going to have sort of a pre-built, very good militia that's almost as good as the regulars, that all come with their own weapons, all come with that Scotch fighting spirit. So they're going to be able to put these units together either on foot or mounted. And this drawing does have some of those in the background. As I said, you can see there's a mounted unit of Highlanders that would also range about. Now, yes, they did wear kilts. So what they would do is they would, when they're mounted, often use buckskin trousers for probably obvious reasons. And they would do the same thing as Mackays. They would range about. There are also Native American groups that would come, and these would not come in huge numbers. Sometimes it would be only 1 or 2 or 10 that would go along and provide scouting work and negotiate with other Native Americans in the area. It's important to remember, too, that Georgia is along the coast and has a lot of rivers, and the rivers define a lot of the boundaries. And so taking care of that part of the colony is also very important. And sort of there in the middle, you can see a fellow who is one of the Marine units. And by Marine, we don't mean like U.S. Marines. We mean literally someone who is like a ranger, but instead of ranging about on horseback, they are on boats. They're on small boats that might hold anywhere from 5 to 10 men, could carry supplies, but could also just patrol up and down the shoreline and up and down the rivers, so that they could keep an eye to see if there were any raiders or pirates or Spanish ships that would come into view, and to say, as they would say, show the flag in the colony. And a lot of the expenses of the military aspects of the colony of Georgia go towards these maritime efforts, because the boats themselves are very expensive. They have to be kept up. They have to be maintained. And, hiring a militia guy to ride a horse is fairly cheap, because anyone at this time period can ride a horse and ride around and tote a musket. But it takes a trained special someone to know how to use a boat, to be a sailor, and especially to be close inshore sailors, to watch for shoals and sandbars, and to know the tides and the currents and everything close in. And so the men who work the boats are going to have to be paid more than those rangers. And so the maritime aspects of the military colony of Georgia is very, very expensive. And it's worth noting, too, as we go into the next slide, that all these men are having to be paid, and all these boats are having to be either purchased or maintained or rented or leased. And where's this money coming from? Well, this is one of the interesting things when you start to look at the finances of the colony of Georgia. Of course, at this point, the colony is not a royal colony. It's being run by the trustees, which is in effect, I guess the closest modern term we could use, it's a modern nonprofit. Right? It's a group of people who have come together to do a good thing, and they are taking charitable contributions. They're putting money out of their own pocket. They're looking for grants, and they're asking Parliament for money. Now, normally Parliament would say, well, what's in this for us? No, thank you very much. But again, Parliament realizes that Georgia could be a very effective buffer colony. And so in the first couple of years, they give £10,000 to the trustees to spend in Georgia. And over the next decade and a half, they give Georgia about $50,000 to £60,000 to support the colony. And what's interesting is when you start looking at these finances, about 80 to 90% of all that money that Parliament gave to the colony of Georgia, did it go for blankets and houses and food and clothing for the colonists? It did not. It went for military-based expenditures. It went to buy muskets. It went to buy firearms and powder and ammunition. It went to pay rangers. It went to pay for their horses. It went to buy these boats to patrol up and down. And then when the war finally comes in 1740, it starts to pay for a lot of those things. This is exclusive of the 42nd, which is paid for by the Crown because it is a regular regiment, even though Oglethorpe has control of it and is able to use it in the colony of Georgia. So you could say Georgia's entire economy at this point is sort of focused around the military aspects and paying for it and supporting it. What is going to happen with this colony that is built for military defense and military action? Well, military events will eventually find Georgia, and that's what I want to talk to you about next. So, events in Europe between Spain and England and other European countries, but that's not what we're talking about right now, come to a head. And what ends up happening is there is a lot of maritime issues between France and England and Spain. And a long story short, a Spanish captain boards an English ship and cuts off a fellow's ear. This fellow's name is Jenkins. And they show the ear, and England is furious that one of its citizens has been treated this way, and so begins the War of Jenkins' Ear. And when Oglethorpe hears about this in Georgia, he's like, finally, action. Oglethorpe is nothing if not adventurous. He is, as he sees himself, a military man, a man of action. And so to do his part for king and country, he immediately musters together everything he can of the 42nd Regiment, and he gets together a huge group of militia, the Highlanders, the men of Augusta, the men of Savannah, and begins an expedition south almost immediately in 1740 to try and capture that Spanish outpost in the colony of Florida, St. Augustine, and the main fort there, the Castillo San Marcos. And he marches all through this area, and it's very interesting. Even though he is a man of action, he doesn't seem to have thought out the supply issues. There are questions as to who's in command. He brings along some South Carolina militia who don't consider themselves under his command, even though he's in charge of the expedition. There are differences in who should garrison which fort and who should go which way, who should get the most supplies. And the force is actually ambushed at a place called Fort Mose. Spanish and Native Americans allied to the Spanish attack at night and almost wipe out a section of Oglethorpe's force. This causes morale to plummet. He finally does get to St. Augustine and realizes there's nothing to lay siege to this town with. This is not an insignificant town. It is a walled town, and the Castillo San Marcos is a very formidable structure. It still exists today. It's the oldest fortified area in the entire North American continent. So it's a big thing, and there's no way for Oglethorpe to get in. So what he decides is, well, maybe we'll just have them starve. We've got a couple of our boats that we've brought with us. We'll sort of patrol the harbor. Well, stronger Spanish warships show up, and Oglethorpe, in effect, has no choice whatsoever but to gather his army back together and march ignominiously back up the coast, back to Fort Frederica, and the expedition is over. He's lost a lot of men. He's lost a lot of credibility. And most important of all, he has really hacked off the Spanish, especially one of the main Spanish governors in the New World who's headquartered in Cuba. And so as 1742 comes to a close, the Spanish decide that they're going to get a force together and go not only pay Oglethorpe a lesson, but take over all those disputed lands that they said were theirs anyway. And so regular forces in Cuba are brought over to Florida. They start out from St. Augustine with a naval escort that goes along the coast with them. This is way bigger than anything that Oglethorpe has at his command, and he realizes it, and they get sort of desperate. And the Spanish land on St. Simon's Island and begin marching that way. And a small contingent goes just there at the channel, and there's a battle at the Battle of Gully Hole Creek, which this is the great thing about the War of Jenkins' Ear in Georgia. There's all kinds of great names. The War of Jenkins' Ear, the Battle of Gully Hole Creek, where the Spanish are sort of kind of victorious and push Oglethorpe's forces back, but then go back to join with their main force. And then the main force begins marching north. And Oglethorpe, being a man of action and having led men in combat before, sets up his men, his 42nd, the Highlanders, and the militia, and at a place called Bloody Marsh. And this is very interesting. This is a perfectly placed ambush, because you can see in this picture behind me of the area where the battle took place. It is it's very marshy, right? There's not a lot of solid land, only very narrow passages that only one or two men can walk across at any one time. And so as the Spanish army is coming forward and they're all strung out, Oglethorpe finally commands his men to open fire. They shoot down a whole bunch of Spanish immediately. The Spanish are able to get enough of a force to charge. Oglethorpe charges back with his Highlanders and wins the day. And the Spanish receive so many casualties that they end up the next day having to go back. It's their turn to retreat ignominiously. They retreat, get back on their ships, go back to St. Augustine. That's the end of the Spanish expedition. And what Oglethorpe and his men don't really know is that's really the end of Spanish excursions into the English colony of Georgia. That war, the War of Jenkins' Ear, expands even bigger, goes well beyond the colonies, and becomes the much broader European General War called the War of the Austrian Succession, which we won't get into today. Suffice to say, Oglethorpe is called back to sort of answer for some things and check on some financial issues. He gets back to England. He is trying to raise more men to go back, gets caught up in 1745 in the Jacobite rebellion in Scotland. Some of his soldiers have to go up there. He is sort of embarrassingly beaten at a battle, which a court of inquiry finds is not his fault, but nevertheless he gets the blame for it. It sort of ruins his reputation, and he never comes back to Georgia at that point. But Georgia, again, is not under threat of the Spanish. They don't know that at first, but as time goes on, it becomes very, very obvious. Moving on, as I said, the Battle of Bloody Marsh was 1742. The Jacobite Rising was 1745. By the time you get to 1748, 49, people are realizing that Georgia seems to be safe. The Spanish don't seem to have any interest in trying to reclaim that northern territory of theirs all the way up to Charleston, or even really mess with the Georgians in what is now a pretty well-established English colony. And so from that point on, Georgia doesn't have to serve as a military buffer. It can begin developing simply as a colony. It can focus on its economic prospects, farming, the well-meaning but not very fruitful attempts at silk production and wine production and things like that, until you get to the end of the trustee period in 1751 and 52. And when you get to the end of the trustee period, it becomes a royal colony. Then Georgia really starts to change economically. They bring slavery into the colony. It begins to prosper. But it's not a military force anymore. Nothing else happens. And that's the interesting thing about Fort Frederica, with no, as I mentioned before, with no need for a large military presence or military support presence. The things that were there for the military sort of start to go away. Fort Frederica is in a pretty inconvenient spot from an economic standpoint, so it shrinks and not much happens to it. Those patrol boats, they rot at their docks. They're not needed anymore. You don't need to pay soldiers. The 42nd is taken back to England, and there is no more regular British military force that comes to Georgia until the American Revolution. And that's really the next thing that happens in Georgia militarily, is the rise of the revolution and the things that happen with that. But that, of course, is a story for another day. Georgia goes from being a military buffer zone to a very highly militarized state by design, until very quickly losing that military aspect and becoming just a regular old colony, slow growing compared to the other 12 colonies, but a regular growing colony nonetheless. And it doesn't play a very large military role going on even into the American Revolution until we get into the 1775, 1776 era. But as I said, that's a story for another day. I hope you've enjoyed this very brief look at Georgia as a military colony. It is absolutely fascinating. And if you are interested in a book that talks about this, there's a book called Drums Along the Southern Frontier. That is probably the best book. Let me rephrase that. It is the best book on the subject. It goes into great detail, has great illustrations, has great maps. And if this period of history and of Georgia's history interests you, I strongly suggest you take a look at that book. It is well worth the acquisition. Thanks for joining us today for this special live stream. We hope you have learned a little bit. We hope we've piqued your curiosity. And until we see you again, whether online or at the Northeast Georgia History Center, stay safe and take care.